say, the gross national product of Sri Lanka this year was, and you will be provided with this information. I mean, obviously there have to be filters and a certain level of sophistication, but never before in history have people been able to have a dialogue in real time with their own cultural database. And the quality of decisions is directly dependent on the quality of the information upon which the decisions are based. And in the past, good quality information is very hard to come by. The mass media is for the peasants. The guys above the 50th floor, and guys it is, as you know, they read special newsletters. They receive feed from certain think tanks. They deal with an entirely different kind of information than you do. Privileged information, managerial information, leader information. Well, now that's all changing. Sitting without telephone lines in Hawaii at the keyboard of my computer, I have better intelligence than Stansfield Turner had when he was director of the CIA for Jimmy Carter. And I'm Joe Nobody, you know, Earth Citizen 1. So that shows you how quickly the quality of information is improving. What you do with this is, of course, has always been an individual dilemma. The psychedelics, to my mind, were a great anticipation of the internet. It probably never would have been built had there not been psychedelics, even though it was built by terminal paranoids, because, you know, it was built as a command and control system for thermonuclear war. And but the wonder of that was that they built it so that it could not be destroyed, not realizing that what that meant was that they could not destroy it. You know, it has no central control. There is no board you bomb, no plug you pull. So they built this indestructible thing, and now it's loose and growing and unstoppable, and possibly leads to the reformulation of the nature of humanity, which would be then an interesting process. Thermonuclear war leads to an enormous paranoid response, which leads to the internet, which leads to liberation. I've always felt that atomic weapons were an enormous IQ booster for the human race. And when you think about the fact that a global tribe of carnivorous monkeys have possessed thermonuclear delivery systems for 50 years, and only twice were they ever used, I think it must have sobered us immeasurably, because there were many issues in those years where, had there not been thermonuclear bombs, there would have been war. And so it became a kind of inoculation against war because it was so horrible, and it forced the human race, I wouldn't go so far as to say grow up, but it propelled us at least into adolescent awareness of our dilemma. Well, it's dinner time. Tonight we'll do the time wave. I doubt we'll revisit this particular area, so if you hated this, it's over. Thank you. We're going to take a sort of conceptual and subject categorical leap here. I assume you all have some familiarity with the I Ching. Is that a reasonable assumption? The I Ching is a Chinese divinatory system of great antiquity. It involves 64 ideograms called hexagrams that are composed of broken and unbroken lines. They are arranged in a traditional sequence called the King-Wen sequence. The divination is carried out through a coin toss operation or a sortilege involving euro stocks. I assume I'm not making headlines with this news for anybody, okay? Good. So, the I Ching, usually translated as the Book of Changes, is in fact a scientific text, in my opinion, a study of great sophistication of the very subject we're talking about this evening, the nature of time, the nature of change. And in the same way that Western science, by fixating through certain Greek predilections on matter, was able to unravel a nuclear chemistry and molecular biology and so forth, these ancient people in China, pre-Han, early Zhou, which we're talking 1500 BC, they weren't interested in matter. They were interested in time. And they brought to this interest in time at least as much energy and sophistication as the research teams at CERN in Switzerland bring to probing the heart of the nucleus of the atom. And they learned things. You know, you spend a millennium or two on a given problem, posing that problem under all circumstances and from many philosophical points of view and pharmacological platforms. Eventually, you begin to get answers. And I believe that the I Ching is a kind of smashed up piece of machinery that in its present form is but a shadow of what it represented in the past in terms of sophistication and understanding. For several thousand years it has been commented on and passed down and preserved by people who were not fully in touch with precisely what it was. You know, under the guidance of the Logos, with the help of psilocybin and so forth and so on, I think I've made some progress with reconstructing what this ancient piece of machinery might have looked like and what kind of information they might have been getting out of it. So now bear with me for a minute, if you haven't been already. As I said, the I Ching is 64 hexagrams, numbered 1 through 64, and usually presented in a traditional sequence called the King Wen sequence, which is old. Nobody knows where it came from. King Wen is a legendary figure. He supposedly got into some political trouble around 1350 BC, and they put him in the can for a while. And while he was there, he figured this out. He thought it up. He built this operating system. And the interesting thing about the King Wen sequence is that it is not in a logical sequence on the face of it. When Leibniz, the European philosopher, got his hands on the I Ching, his Jesuit friends shipped him a copy in the 17th century, he immediately organized it as a binary number system and rearranged the hexagram and showed that it was a binary number system. And Leibniz's sequence, any hacker knows instantly how to do it from the first hexagram on. King Wen's sequence is not at all obviously under any set of rules. And the Logos in its promptings, to me, it was interesting. It was like a koan. You know, a problem which a master sets a student, which must be solved before we can move on to deeper water. And the koan was, you know, what are the ordering principles of the King Wen sequence? Can you prove, in fact, that it is the product of intent? Or is it, in fact, simply a jumble that has become traditional over thousands of years, and there is no set of rules for generating the King Wen sequence? Pretty close focus stuff, you notice. We're not talking here about planetary transformation or human fusion with the biosphere. It's very academic, close focus, analytical stuff. So I looked at the King Wen sequence, and I was intuitively led, is probably the way to put it, to look at what's called the first order of difference. The first order of difference is a very simple concept. It simply means how many lines change as you go from one hexagram to the next. Simple, right? Okay, so as you go from hexagram 1 to 2, there's a certain change value, 6 or whatever it is, and then 3 to 4, 4 to 5, so forth, and so on. And so I found out what these data points were, and then I drew a graph of these values down to 64. And it's just a symbol of it, obviously. And so I looked at this thing for a long time, and it didn't seem to have any, it looked stochastic, random. It didn't seem to have any particular order to it. But then I noticed a very interesting thing, which is that this section is a mirror image of this section, such that imagine making a copy of this and putting it right here, and then rotating it 180 degrees in the plane, meaning turn it upside down to the non-technical folks. Turn it upside down, well, then it will slide into itself. A perfect fit here and here. So then you get something which looks like this. In other words, it has closure at the beginning and closure at the end, but no closure in between. Interesting thing about these data points is that if you think about the possible data points, they are obviously 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, the number of lines that can change as you go from one hexagram to another. In fact, there are no 5s. If you look at the King-Wen sequence, one of the first things you notice is that it is not simply 64 hexagrams. It is really 32 pairs of hexagrams, because each pair, the pairs are formed by turning the first term upside down. Now, there are 8 cases where turning a hexagram upside down has no effect on it. And in all 8 cases, it is followed by a hexagram which is exactly its opposite. And so the rule obviously is, if turning a hexagram upside down causes no change, all lines change. Then you can analyze these data points, and you discover that there are 75% odd values, 25% even values, exactly. So no 5s. This 3-to-1 ratio of odd to even and this peculiar closure seem to me sufficient argument that this is the product of human intent. This was supposed to be done this way. And in fact, in some of the older commentary on the I Ching, there's a passage in which it says the forward-running numbers refer to the past, the backward-running numbers refer to the future. Well, now in the I Ching there are no backward-running numbers, but in this thing there are. Because when you make this, you have 1, 2, 3 to 64, but what you've got over here is 63, 62, 61, down to 1, and what you've got over here is equals 64, 64, 64. It always sums to 64. So what this is some kind of magical, occult, multi-leveled, mana-laden thing that these pre-Zhou diviners dreamed up. Essentially, the entire I Ching has been turned into this monoglyph of itself. Well, so now let's symbolize this thing by the letter S. A hexagram, as you know, is made of 6 lines. It's also, if you know a little more about it, in the commentaries, it's always thought of as being formed of 2 trigrams, 2 3-line structures. And then it has an essential and very powerful cohesive unity as a hexagram, as a unity. as a 1. So every hexagram has 6 lines, 2 trigrams, and 1 wholeness to it. So the thought which occurred to me under the strong prompting of the Logos was to take this thing which I just showed you, which is at the top of a kind of hierarchy, and move it to the bottom of the hierarchy. And I did it and build a hexagram. So remember how I said we'll symbolize that thing by the letter S? So I took 6 of those, and I did this. Yeah, 6. I laid 6 in a row, and that stood in my mind for the 6 lines of a hexagram. But over this, I lay then 2. Like that. Those are the trigrams. And then I'm sure you anticipate my thought. Over that, I lay 1. That stands for the unity of the hexagram. Okay, so now what I had was a lot of lines running everywhere, and the absolute conviction that I now possessed an enormous secret of some sort, the map of time, the picture of history, the snapshot of the zeitgeist moving through a higher dimension, something like that. And I was a burden to my friends and a joy to my enemies for many, many months as I attempted to corner people in all-night conversations of great energy and perplexity that had my friends meeting to plan what is to be done. Hope this never happens to you. And finally, Ralph Abraham, God love him, said, it's an occult thing. I mean, it's just this occult thing. Only you understand it. And it's not even clear that your interpretation is always the same. He said, what you have to do is you have to turn it into an ordinary mathematical object that is, a known quantity. Well, essentially, this was like telling your dog to split the atom. It was like, great, Ralph, thanks. Do you think you'll have any time in the next few months to put in on this? And so I sat with it for a couple of years. And then one afternoon, I was getting loaded and watching dust motes in a sunbeam and not thinking about anything much at all. And I had it, whole and entire. I saw how to take this occult thing, how to take its multiple properties, such as degree of parallelism, skew, overlap, the scales of the 3 levels, and all of these variables, and I saw how to collapse it into an ordinary mathematical object. And it's quite trivial. I won't bore you with it. It's so trivial. It basically has to do with deconstructing the wave, assigning numerical values to all of its parts, rebuilding it, and then adding them up. And then, lo and behold, all these intuitions you had about how when it is parallel and close together, values should drop and all that, are conserved, and we get the time wave. And the time wave and the computer is simply doing a whole lot of housekeeping work with it and not making any arithmetical errors and scaling it to time. Now, the objection that could be made to this, or easily could be made to it, and that I at one time felt the force of this objection. I've talked myself out of it now, but it's how I would have attacked it myself at a certain point. And it went something like this. Now let's see. You are advocating a revision in physics based on a Chinese oracle that you have deciphered a secret message from? Is that it? And how long have you had this particular delusion? So I've built a metaphor, which I hope makes it a little clearer why I believe it is reasonable to use a Chinese oracle as a stepping stone to a revision of physics. And in order to explain this, I have to have resort to a fairly elaborate metaphor. So here it is. Think of sand dunes. Just picture them in your mind for a moment. Now, notice that this picture in your mind of these dunes, that the dunes look like wind. They look like wind. Now, sand dunes are made by wind. What's going on here? The wind is a variation in pressure gradients over time, which moves the sand around. And when the wind stops blowing, what is left is essentially a lower dimensional signature of this higher dimensional phenomenon. Comme ci, comme ça. Now, for grains of sand, substitute genes. For wind, substitute millions of years of evolutionary time. Time flows, and the genes move around, and they assume certain configurations. I maintain that those configurations are lower dimensional slices of the higher dimensional architecture of time itself. In other words, we bear the thumbprint of the medium in which we arose. We bear it in every cell of our bodies. Every atom bears it. Every molecule bears it. And this, if this can be known, this pattern of time that is impressed in all organism and perhaps all matter, then time, an understanding of time unfolds as a fractal, an infinitely self-similar structure that is repeating different patterns on many, many scales in order to create the phenomenology of the universe as we experience it. So, that's basically the theory. And then the theory, I don't think, would amount to much if it weren't for the fact that with the computer, we can now take the theory and ask the question, okay, given all this arm waving and theorizing, does the unfolding wave actually mirror and hence predict the unfolding of the historical continuum? I maintain that at this stage, it's arguable that it does. Now, there's a curious and unsettling aspect to all of this. If you have a theory of wave mechanics of any system, waves have wavelength. Therefore, the wave must be generated from some point. And if what we're talking about is a graphic congruence between theory and nature, then theory must be fitted to nature in the search for a best fit between the curve, the describing curve, and the phenomena it seeks to describe. You understand what I mean? Now, the problem is, with this theory, if it is a problem, is that when we compute our best fit of the curve to the data, we reach a fairly unexpected conclusion, which is that novelty is going to reach infinity within our own lifetimes. That the universal process that has been going on for billions of years across this epigenetic landscape, wandering deeper and deeper into realms of novelty, faster and faster and deeper, is actually going to become mathematically outside of our description within our own lifetime, specifically in 2012 AD. It's not pleasing, this prophecy of the end of the world within one's own lifetime. This is the typical pattern of delusional messianism that is so drearily familiar. Nevertheless, we have more than a Lullian decoding of Scripture here. We have a formal and completely unambiguous algorithm, and we have a body of data. So I just will now demonstrate it to you, and you can reach your own conclusions. There are people who may not even be aware of this theory, who have reached the same conclusion. Some by avenues I respect, and some by avenues I don't respect. And without saying who's who, I'll list some of these approaches. There's a group of people, I believe they're called extopians or singularists. They're engineers. They're total rationalists. They're tech heads. And they say that the rate of energy release, information storage, and technological advance is proceeding so rapidly that sometime between 2010 and 2025, the whole system becomes unrecognizable to itself. Congruence with this prediction. The Maya civilization, which perished a millennia ago, had a 5,600 plus year calendar that culminates on the exact same day that this theory computes to, a fact which I didn't know when I made my choice for the end date. There are Hasidic Jews in Israel who believe that they have Kabbalistic logic to support the conclusion that the Messiah will appear in late July of 2012. And then someone mentioned last night this Vedic.
It's called Jyotish. It's spelled J-O-Y.
A form of astrology, right?
It's Vedic astrology, 3,000 or 4,000 years old.
So, whether you do it whether you calculate toward it mathematically or intuitionally or whatever, and whether you exist now or in the case of the Maya, a millennia ago, certain people, by certain techniques, seem to have located a peculiar moment in time. And what exactly this means, we don't know, but this wave scales to it as well. Now, what I want to do here, this is this year, and pointing at today, and as you see, it will culminate here. But what I want to do now is put a lot of time on the screen and show you how this thing works. So let me specify time span, E. Okay, well, now here what we're looking at here is a very large span of time, 6 billion years. And the entire career of life on Earth is 600 million years, which is this downsweep. So you see, at that scale, it's like a done deal. It's almost a smooth curve. On a scale of 600 million years, it's just been an uninterrupted rush toward the omega point ever since we dropped gills and crawled out onto the land. As we magnify and zoom into this, it turns out there was a lot of drama along the way. Let me see if I can get my zoom going here. Now, each time it makes a new graph, we'll see twice as much detail and half as much time. There's 1.5 billion years. There's the last 750 million years. 375 million years. That's all life, getting hold of the planet. There's the last 100 million years. Here, let me stop that one. Okay, that's the last 93 million years, and there is a event that has to be predicted correctly for the theory to work. At 65 million years, there was an asteroid impact that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs, and there it is. It's an exact science, folks, but I'm not. Okay, here is this extinction event. You've got 113 million years on the screen, ending at the 0 point in 2012, and this massive extinction event, 65 million years, clearly shows as the most dramatic event on the screen. Yeah.
So what is the opposite of the descent into novelty as you see the increasing point of the scale reaching maximum at a slightly earlier time period? What's the converse?
Equilibrium. Yes, and then homeostasis. Yeah, I mean, homeostasis is the perfect example because homeostasis is repetition, closed energy cycle.
Absence of chaos.
Absence of chaos. Predictability, in other words. And then it inevitably reaches a place where there's a symmetry break and then a cascade. Okay, so now let's start our zoom forward again. Well, what you do is there's 46 million years. Let's get down here to something palpable. 11 million years. This is primate territory.
Where did you hit the asteroid date?
Just published material in Nature. There's the last 2 million years, like that. The question was?
How do you know when to start?
You mean how did I choose the end date?
Or the beginning date of the whole?
Well, the beginning date I'm a little fuzzy on. I simply propagated it back until I had more time than astrophysics requires for the life of the universe. And that was all I needed. I'm not entirely committed to the Big Bang. There's plenty of odd assumptions in all of that stuff. What I did was I thought about, at first I tried to scale it to the stuff I knew. So I've been sort of interested in history. So I said, okay, if you have a theory of novelty of history, where are the novel points in history without getting too technical? Well, I think anybody who's studied history 25 minutes would nominate the Greek Golden Age, the Italian Renaissance, and the 20th century. Or at least they would tolerate those candidates. So I said, well, let's see if we can find a place where 3 big troughs do that, and then let's look at the crucifixion or something else, in other words, to see if it also appears to be correctly described. Well, eventually you get a fit where you can go from the Big Bang down to Nixon's resignation and always have this very satisfying feeling that it's giving it the correct scoring at the correct level of novelty and the correct ratio and proportion to the events in which it is embedded. And when I got it right, the last 67-year cycle begins the day the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And it's a resonance, you see, with the Big Bang. And then everything else seemed to fall into place at that point. Now, it's tricky. It is tricky because it's a fractal. And so there are possibilities of error, but and that's why periods of time like what we're living through are so interesting, because you see, I've made the small-scale prediction that this period we're living in will be novel based on large-scale correlations. Now, if the prediction comes true, that clinches it. It shows then that the choice was correct, and we gain confidence. And I maintain there's, in principle, no reason why this much information shouldn't be known about the future. The future is not magically guarded from understanding any more than any other part of nature is. And in fact, statistics, probability theory, is a valiant effort to come to terms with the future. I maintain horribly and inevitably flawed by the assumption of linear time. What do I mean by that? Well, here's how probability theory works. Say you want to know, well, let me think of something, the charge on a certain, how much electricity is running through a wire. You want to know this. Well, here's how you do it in ordinary science these days. You measure the electricity 10,000 times, you add it together, and you divide by 10,000. Now, it's conceivable that the value you come up with will not match a single one of your measurements. Your measurements never agreed with this value. So what we're doing, you see, is because we assume time is uniform, we don't feel any intellectual sin in smearing those values that way. The law of averages damps the novelty in the system, and you get a kind of averaging. Probability theory cannot be done anymore with impunity if this is true.
Chucking the whole sort of plug of physics to the last 50 years, and I think you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
You mean to attack probability theory?
Oh, to ignore the excitement and the thrill of totally insanity that comes from quantum mechanics and relativity.
Well, no, I'm not rejecting that. The quanta is far larger than probability theory. I think, there's an interesting revolution going on in quantum physics right now. It amuses me. Arguably, the one concept that seems secure in 20th century physics, and about which there has been more ballyhoo and self-congratulations than about any other single concept, is the much vaunted uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, which is supposed to be a bridge to understanding consciousness, uniting science and art, letting us see the scintillating, elusive, mercurial beauty of the It turns out it's a BS, to put it as kindly as possible. When the Bohr-Heisenberg theory was formulated, there was another theory of the quanta on the table. But this theory had an assumption built into it which was thought to be so fantastic that it was never seriously considered, and instead this uncertainty principle was taken on board. The notion which was built into the rejected version of the quanta was called non-locality, and it held that somehow all particles that had ever been in interaction with each other in the past were somehow mysteriously and instantaneously linked to each other throughout all space and time instantaneously. And since all particles were once confined in a space less than the diameter of the nucleus of a Joe atom, then presumably all particles in the universe were connected together through this non-locality, if you accepted this B theory of the quanta. So it was rejected out of hand. This was a theory formulated by David Bohm. Well, now it comes back to haunt them because there is non-locality. It's been confirmed. At first, it was only there were thought experiments with it. Yes, and so here, but now experiments are being done where you actually bring two electrons together separate them in space, flip the spin of one, and see the other one flip its spin, even though they're now separated in time and space. So the physics community, and let me say about the Bohm theory and the Bohr-Heisenberg formulation, the mathematics is identical. The mathematics is identical. One does not give better results than the other, but they have these completely antithetical concepts built into them, and I doubt that the Heisenberg thing will survive. It was actually a mistake. Oh, and that what I want to say then about the Bohm formulation is, with Bohm's mathematics, velocity and location can be known simultaneously to any limit of exactitude. There is no uncertainty in the in the Bohm formulation. I don't know how I got off on this. Yeah.
My proposal to you is that those guys are having the same kind of fun and are not dealing with Archimedean events. That I think you'd feel very warm and close to them, because that is analogous to the one you're looking at.
Yeah, I would assume that if I'm right and if they're right, we'll have to meet somewhere out there. There's this guy Lentz at Stanford who has a very interesting cosmology which he calls a fractal foam cosmology. And I don't understand his mathematics, but he talks about how in his cosmology, in the first few moments of the universe, these things were generated which he calls scalar waves. And they're waves, but they don't move. They're, as he puts it, frozen in space-time. But the reason you know they're there is because they affect the clustering and the ebb and flow of probability. That's it. That's it. I mean, it's absolutely it. So what Lentz's scalar waves have to do with the time wave, I don't know, but it's very, very interesting that these kinds of theories now are coming forward. I think it's because we are feeling an inadequacy in our science because the fine structure of complex systems won't come into focus using statistical analysis. You get a blurred picture of what's going on, and no matter how you deal with the data, it remains blurred because this temporal variable is in there that you're not aware of, and it's creating this inadequacy in your model. You wanted to say something?
Two questions. First, how do you introduce data into the system? In other words, given the I-Ching as the construct, right, and a formula derived from that, which is the assumption I'm making here, what do you enter to create the graph?
You enter the valuations of there are 384 points in this thing because it's 6 times 64. So, and at each one of these positions, you generate a a number, and then that is fractalized and put through this. And this is all explained exhaustively in the Invisible Landscape, and in the manual for this thing is now 75 pages long. And
the second question is taking a 500-year model or a 250-year model or whatever we would choose in current time. Is there a replication of the pattern currently shown with a decline of that order being demonstrated at any other point in history?
Yes, the question you're asking is, are there resonances inside the system? And of course there are, because it's fractal. So self-similarity occurs at many scales, and as you see with a normal fractal, self-similarity is hierarchical. This has hierarchical self-similarity, but it also has a degree of internal self-similarity on every on every level. So this plunge that we're going through right now, its resonance, its direct historical resonance on the preceding larger scale is the period around the 10th century, 948 AD. Now, what happened in that period is there was an enormous cultural efflorescence in Islam. The Umayyad Caliphate at Cordoba and the other Umayyad Caliphate at Baghdad were producing, and a lot of it was mathematical and technical. It's arguable that that was the birth of modern science. Those kinds of resonances can be used as a basis for prediction is something I haven't had time to look at. There are many resonances to each point. It's not a simple system. We can only discuss it in simple terms, but in the MS-DOS version, it will print a page full of resonances. And let me explain how I imagine time in this thing. Here's, first of all, how the Newtonians imagine time. If you ask a Newtonian, what is the most important moment impinging on this one? In other words, what moment is most important in shaping this moment? He will tell you, or she will tell you, it's the moment immediately before. This is this amazing faith in the momentum of cause and effect. This takes a completely different view and says any given moment in time is a kind of interference pattern caused by the existence of other moments in time, and that time is in fact an extremely complex, data-heavy kind of holographic matrix. And if you can decondition yourself from your large-scale position in things, you can actually feel or sense the continuum. I mean, I got it down to an aphorism. Rome falls 9 times an hour. And if you're paying attention, you'll feel it go by every time. And if you are cleaning your apartment or walking in the woods, if you notice, you think things that there is no rationale for. And as hemlines rise and fall on a slightly different scale, and as art movements come and go on a slightly different scale, what is all this? Well, it's other times, other resonances. It was very interesting. At the website a couple of months ago, I said that I looked at the wave and I said the end of the year would have a medieval flavor because we were crossing through the late 8th century or something. And then I noticed, that the liberals have this thing every Christmas time, this in Hilton Head, North Carolina, called the Renaissance Gathering, and Clinton always goes. So all the right-wingers got together at this thing called the Dark Ages as a satire on the Renaissance, and their Dark Age gathering occurred right in the darkest of the Dark Ages in the resonance. A lot of this is for the production of humor, I hope you realize. If you're fans of James Joyce and understand how Ulysses is constructed, what's going on in Ulysses is a man is trying to buy some kidneys to take back to his apartment to fry for breakfast. But somehow, in visiting the butcher and the local bar and running into an old friend, the entire Homeric war is fought out in these few blocks of Dublin, and also the entire fall and redemption of mankind. And this is called allegory, and it's nested reference and fractal association, and it's a very powerful way to make art. And I think it's a very powerful way to make art because it's how nature made the world. The world is an allegory, and it's based on analogies. I mean, I look sometimes at people and I see other people, I see faces from the past, sometimes my past, sometimes further back. Time is an interference pattern. Yeah.
The one thing I'm a little confused about is how you draw a pattern to a given scale. Like, does it make sense to say you could put in Terence McKenna's birthday and see his timing?
People always ask this question. Yeah, although I'm not entirely comfortable with it. Let me trace the history of this kind of thinking for you. Astrology has obviously has certain analogs to this, because it's about predicting the fates of dynasties and so forth from the movement of the stars, and it's a peculiar combination of mathematical exactitude and occult fancy. Oh God, I've lost the thread. Ask again. The birthday thing, yes. So originally, astrology was a tool for statecraft. Royal houses and wars and stuff were fought and that kind of thing. Well, the first, I don't know if they were the first, but the first large crop of yuppies was late Roman. And these people had vast wealth, and they dabbled in the occult, and they were interested in these mystery religions, and they were aware of astrology as a tool of statecraft. And people asked the very same question. Said, I'm an important person. Can you do a horoscope for me? And so then the natal horoscope was invented around that time, 1st century AD, the natal horoscope. I can imagine that we each have our own time wave, in a sense, and that it begins at your birth and it ends at your death, or your death is a very novel point in the wave. The wave has different cycles in it. This has 384 data points. I mentioned that. Notice that 384 is exactly 13 lunations. At first I thought I was discovering a Neolithic Chinese calendar, that it's an extraordinarily accurate lunar count. It precesses 19 days per year against the sun, but that might be a price people would be willing to pay, especially if it had been developed in a tropical climate. But each larger cycle is made by multiplying that number, 384, by 64. And each smaller cycle is made by taking that number and dividing it by 64. And what you get then, over about 20 levels, stretching from 72 billion years at the top, down to 6.55 times 10 to the minus 23rd at the bottom. In other words, the domain of Planck's constant, the realm of the jiffy. You get this set of nested cycles. Well, the next cycle up from this, from the 384-day cycle, is 67 years, 104.25 days. It's 6 sunspot cycles of the minor type, 2 of the major type, but interestingly close to the average human lifespan. 67 years, almost as though it's a kind of a tone, an octave of existence. I'm very interested in people's 68th year of life, what that feels like. Because in a sense, if you live to be 68 in this theory, you get to start over. You were sort of, your slate is cleaned, and you get to go forward. But this kind of thing I find, I'm not that attracted to it. I'm more interested in the idea that this is some kind of a message from somewhere, and that the message is in 2 parts. The first part is, something extraordinary is going to happen to you and your world in 2012. And the second part is, and the reason you should believe the first part is because this wave which predicts that, predicts all things which preceded it. predicted the Italian Renaissance, so forth and so on. Let me start this puppy going again, and I'll show you what I mean. What have we got? 1,000,000.4 on the screen.
What's the locality of it? Does this apply to our galaxy, the whole universe, or this planet?
Well, that's another good question. I've thought about it on all different ways, and I think it's local. I'm not sure how local.
So is the King went and other planets to come up with the pattern that you used?
Well, if it's a universal fractal pattern, then it must be available in many places. A thing that would be very satisfying to me would be if somebody could find this same set of numbers somewhere else in nature. Anywhere. I can't. The Fibonacci series.
Yeah. The Fibonacci can be brought out from simple rules into a complex set of data.
It sounds like that any moment in time can be decomposed into a number of hexagrams, and that the hexagrams have divinatory components to them, and that a hexagram has a meaning that you can draw from it. Is there a sense in which you can figure out what hexagrams correspond with what moment and figure out the characteristics of that moment?
Yes, you can, and you could build a vast interpretive industry on that. In other words, there would be a way to extract meaning rather than mathematics from this. What you would do is you would look at a given point in the wave and not only look at its wave structure, but say what hexagrams are building this and what are the ratios of the influences that they're contributing. And that is basically, that's another lifetime of work for me, but that would be very, very rich stuff. Okay, let's go. Let it run for a minute. That's 1.4 billion years, 730,000 years, 366,000 years, 183,000 years. Now those are glaciations in there. That's the last 100,000, 45,000. Now let's look at this. This is the last. This is basically 5,000 BC. Now the stakes rise because we know with fairly high detail what has gone on in the last 5,000 years in terms of inventions, cultural migrations, dynasties, so forth and so on. So this is from 5,000 BC to the present. Well, along this descent into novelty here are the great ancient civilizations. Ur, Chaldea, Babylon, and down here in the bottom of the novelty trough, pre-dynastic Egypt, Old Kingdom Egypt. In other words, the great pyramids are built precisely at the most novel point of that trough, which sort of supports the theosophical faith that Egypt did learn something that it took a long time to go past them. Not necessarily 1950. According to the time wave, they were the most novel thing that had ever come down the pike until roughly the foundation of the Roman Republic. And that's about right. That feels about right. On this upslope, this is all pretty ugly stuff here. The Hittites, the Mitanni, Assyria. We're really getting into male dominance, warfare as a way of life, empire building, slavery, huge building projects based on human agony. Ugly business, but it's punctuated by some real moments of progress, like the Phoenician alphabet and so forth and so on. And up here at the top of this thing, Homer sings his song. The Trojan Wars occur actually just slightly before that. What's happening there is that Mycenaean piracy is overwhelming the old Minoan Empire. This is just in a small part of the world, but it happens to have a lot of consequences. Let me say about that, some people say your theory is so Eurocentric. Have you noticed what kind of world you're living in? That's right. That's why the theory is Eurocentric. In other words, the Maya may have been wonderful, but what counts in the historical game is how much influence you have on the present. And the Maya have no influence on the present. I mean, other than some interesting shards in the museums and a respect for their architecture, they didn't pass it on. So, there isn't a man, woman, and child on this earth who wasn't deeply affected by what went on in Greece in the 5th century BC. Not a man, woman, or child on this planet. Now, what was going on in 5th century BC somewhere else, that river of influence may not have reached the present. Some did, some didn't. But something got loose at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, right up in this time span. I think it's the phonetic alphabet. I think the phonetic alphabet empowers a distancing from the object of your concern that allows this eerie Faustian thing that is so typical of the Western mind. And I didn't originate that idea. Many people have commented that the Greek alphabet, it just carries you so far into abstraction that then that thought style becomes inevitable. Yeah.
Obviously, you've been describing events in Western culture. What are the correlatives to Indo-Asia?
Yes, good question. In spite of the objection that the thing is culturally skewed toward European history, if you actually study world history, it's interesting. Great advances seem to occur simultaneously in different places. In and of itself, an argument for something like the time wave. So, while the Roman Empire is rising and establishing law and order and so forth and so on, the Han Dynasty is doing the same thing in China. As the Maya are reaching their cultural apex with their astronomy and their mathematics and so city building and so forth and so on, the Cordovan caliphates are doing the same thing. There's quite a bit of that sort of thing.
Is there an antithesis here at all measurable? I mean, a contradiction?
I don't understand.
Well, in other words, where one series of events would describe homostasis, another series of events would describe a descent into novelty. In other words, have you located any contradiction within the prescribed system?
No, because a descent into novelty, as it were, takes precedence. Equilibrium only counts if it completely pervades the system. You see what I mean? All right, let's go forward into this because I want you to see these later epochs. Oh, I guess I didn't enter the thing. I want you to see these later epochs because this is where we can really judge it more accurately. This is basically from 300 AD. AD, yes. This is from the fall of Rome to the present, not precisely. The fall of Rome it took a long time, and there were humiliation after humiliation. But generally, the kidnapping of Augustus Romulus in 375 is considered to be the final straw. So notice that what this says is that after the fall of Rome here, history had a different character. It was not a steep and fairly uninterrupted descent into novelty, but it began to oscillate between periods of novelty and periods of intense recidivism. And notice also that this theory is not shy about making predictions. Now we're down on it. And this extraordinarily steep descent into novelty right here, that's the resonance to what's happening right now. That's 10th century Islam. This one which precedes it over here is the foundation moment of Islam. Muhammad is born in 570 and died in 630. That whole thing occurs along this descent. Islam is very important. I have to stress this because we all live in a culture that is totally anti-Islamic. And, it's perfectly legitimate to talk about ragheads and this and that. But I've got news for you. The science, the mathematics, the architecture, the poetry, the administrative skills, the knowledge of hydrology, so forth and so on. And for any people or person who is truly alarmed by modernity, we were talking about this evening, Islam is an answer. And I imagine it's going to experience great growth over the next few years. These portions of Central Asia that were held by the old Soviet Union, Kyrgyzia, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, and all of these places, if they were ruled by the people who live there, they would be radical Islamic republics. It's conceivable that in this period over the next few months, there could be a worldwide uprising of Islam that would end with it making the greatest territorial gains since it's made in the 10th century. If all Muslims were ruled by Muslim governments, an enormous reconstruction of the boundaries of the world would take place. So these two descents both seem related to Islam. I mean, Europe is just a mess at this time. I mean, Macrobius, writing in the 5th century, thought that the circumference of a circle was twice its diameter. What? They didn't have string? I don't know. Imagine that. That's how low things sunk in Europe while these people were gazing at the stars and inventing the quadratic equation and so forth and so on. Okay, this one, hard for you to see, occurs in 1122. That's the crusade which breaks apart the stasis of medieval Europe and lets in all kinds of novelty, right? Now, the next one is this one, and this is an interesting one and illustrates how the character of descents, the different characters of kinds of descent into novelty. Let me get it on the screen a little bigger here. Here it is, this one. Now, it's a dramatic descent into novelty, but unlike most descents into novelty, it's also a dramatic return to normalcy. Now, what kind of event would give a signature like that? A dramatic descent into novelty, a dramatic ascent back to the previous
Fall of empire and growth of another empire includes time.
Well, how about this? An epidemic disease. Yes, 1356. 1/3 of the population of Europe dies in 18 months. But now think about that. It's catastrophic. It's traumatic. But no new technology is introduced. No boundaries are shifted. No new religion enters the area. And no genes cross frontiers.